All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this chairman webinar on Wednesday here. We have a very interesting presentation by Chuck Shavit from CloudAhoy. Oddly enough, I've actually dealt with CloudAhoy for many years, from when they were just first starting, and it's a very, very good product, and definitely helps in the debriefing process. So we're happy to have Chuck here. And Chuck, can you talk right now?
I can try.
Okay, well, you can, and you did. So thank you very much for joining us, and we really appreciate it. For those members out there, this is Rick Todd. I'm president of NAFI. Got a lot of exciting things coming up that we'll touch base on the end of the program. You'll see on the slides here, we have a couple things as well. One very important thing that you all need to think about is the Flight Instructor Hall of Fame. Nominations need to be in for that. So go onto the website, check it out, and there's multiple links. John Niehaus has posted up on the Facebook page as well. But it's right there. If you go into the Hall of Fame, you can fill that out. So Chuck, we're really, really happy to have you with us, and very appreciative of the offer that you've extended our members, and we're very excited to hear about this. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and send the screen over to you, and we're going to kind of go from there, okay?
Just go briefly over the stuff that that wasn't visible before about technology. I was saying that technology changes our lives, and I was giving as an example technology for making athletes better athletes. So we still train them the way that we always train them, but we have some technology to help in catching some specific moments in the training and explaining to them how to become even better athletes. We all are flying, and we know that flight planning had dramatically changed in the past 15 years compared to what it is today. We know that in the cockpit, technology had radically changed the way that we fly without paper charts and with better situational awareness. And likewise, in flight training, in the post-flight debrief, things are done differently today than they were done 15 years ago. We have a host of technologies today to help in the post-flight debrief. So it's not just the stuff that we do, when the plane taxis back to the ramp, but we have software like CloudAhoy and other software and cameras and so on to help us in the post-flight debrief. So we are in for the debrief. We are the only company I'm aware of that is totally dedicated to flight debrief. That's what we do. That's what we are about. Hopefully now we are in sync with where we were before. Most of my presentation today is going to be around the debrief tab of CloudAhoy, showing you different scenarios and how we analyze them. But before we dive into the debrief scenarios, I want to mention a few things about using CloudAhoy. One is about the flights tab. So the flights tab shows you all of your flights, give you a list of all of your flights here on the left side. On the right side, a selected flight, we provide you information including the thumbnail, the total air and ground time, wheels up and wheels down, total runway, all the runways used in the flight and things like that. And we also provide a list of maneuvers which CloudAhoy detects for us. One other thing I want to mention before diving into the actual debrief is, let me actually close this window here, is how does flight data get into CloudAhoy so you can debrief your flights. We have three main methods of obtaining flight data and uploading it to CloudAhoy. The simplest one is to using our apps, using our free apps on iPhone, iPad, and Android devices. You can use the app, tap Start. It'll start logging the flight. You can use the internal GPS in the device for the track information, or you can use external GPS devices for even better quality. The second method is to use ForeFlight. You can log the flight with ForeFlight and then import the ForeFlight flight track into CloudAhoy. The benefit of that is that if you are using Stratus 2 or Garmin GDL 39 3D, you also get AHRS data, which is useful for the debrief. So that's another method easy method of logging data. And the third one, which is the most accurate information, the most rich, is to use the SD card or the memory stick in your EFIS, in your cockpit, whether you're flying a Garmin G1000 or Cirrus Perspective or a host of other EFIS devices. You can import the data, and then the benefit of that is that it's not only very high accuracy data, but you also get a host of other information, including engine data, nav and com information, and more, that is very helpful for the debrief. In my presentation today, I'm going to be showing you several debrief scenarios, very short each one, showing you what we call structured evaluation, and provide different multiple snippets of slides. Let me start by showing you the briefing of an engine out situation. So here's the FAA's airplane flying handbook picture showing how to trim for best glide speed once you lose an engine. And the same book gives you a list of common errors when students execute this maneuver and then practice engine out situations. And I'd like to divide the errors into two kinds. There are the objective errors, such as attempting to stress the glide by applying back elevator pressure or failure to lower the pitch attitude during the glide. These can actually be monitored and checked with CloudAhoy. You can sit with a student and discuss those issues if they were. Other errors are subjective by nature, like the inability of the student to sense changes in airspeed through sound and feel. CloudAhoy is not going to help you in that. These are just talking points between you and the student. Here's the emergency checklist for a Cessna 172, which lists multiple things, including the airspeeds. So the maximum glide, best glide is 68 knots for the C-172. Using that and using other factors, I created here a table of things that I'd like to check with the student and evaluate the performance of the student. And those include pitch control after engine out, establish and maintain best glide speed, if turning, whether or not it was a steady bank turn during the engine out. I'm going to show you a scenario developed by Redbird and used in the Pilot Proficiency Center in 2016. We worked with Redbird on the debrief of those scenarios. So the idea was that pilots were using Redbird simulators in the Pilot Proficiency Center. The Redbird Sidekick product uploaded the information immediately after the flight to CloudAhoy, and then the students would be able to move to the next tent and debrief their flight with the CFI after they've flown the simulator. The first scenario here was flown from an airport in Idaho, McCall Municipal, on a Redbird. And the idea here was that a student would take off, and immediately after takeoff, the CFI would cut power, and the student would have to decide what to do. So we are simulating in this case an engine out on the downwind. CloudAhoy shows you here the flight path in 3D on the right. It shows you a synthetic vision window, which is what the student was seeing when flying the simulator, and shows you a bunch of graphs that we are going to review. Now the flight departed where it says takeoff here. CloudAhoy automatically segmented the flight into the takeoff roll, and then the actual climb, which is in light blue. And it also detected a stall, which it depicted in red. So we already know that this specific flight didn't really end very well. So let's see what actually happened during the flight. I'm going to start animating the flight. And as I animate, the plane position is going to change on the 3D graph. You can see a little ball moving slowly on the 3D graph. We can see the synthetic vision, and we can see that the plane is now in a climb. The three graphs that we are showing here are RPM, altitude, and airspeed. So the student was climbing at 65 knots. I kind of do fast forward here. He's now on the downwind, still climbing. And watch the RPM graph on the top. The RPM now is at about 2,400 RPM. And the instructor is now pulling the RPM back, pulling the throttle back. We have an engine out situation. Let's see what the student had done. The student started this thing at 62 knots. Immediately he pitched up, and as a result, now we are at 55 knots. We can see that the altitude is lost rapidly. He's at 1,500 feet per minute on his way back to the runway. He's pulling even more. He's now at 52, 50, 49 knots. He's getting really close. He's at 20 degrees pitch up, and he crashed. Our evaluation, the evaluation chart that we built before, that we can now fill. He failed the pitch control after engine out. He raised the nose during the approach. Did he establish and maintain best glide speed? No. The best glide was 68. He was at 55 at best. Well, the good thing is that he had a steady bank there. That was a good thing. The same scenario, or almost same scenario, flown by another student. Again, the same airport, and the same situation there with the Redbird at the Pilot Proficiency Center. Here, the flight departed from the north, is flying south. And again, we look at our evaluation chart for this specific maneuver. We want to check whether or not the student had done a good job with the pitch control after engine out, establish and maintain best glide speed, and if turning, whether it was a steady turn. The student now is climbing. He is at 72 knots on the climb. The instructor pulled back the throttle. We have an engine out situation. The student's speed momentarily dropped to 60 or 58, but now he's pitching down 5 to 10 degrees. His speed increases. It's now 68. And he looks for an area to land the plane, finds an area just straight ahead. He flares, and he lands the plane, hopefully safely. So he did exactly what he was supposed to do based on the best recommendation. Pitch control after engine out was good. He lowered the nose after the engine out. Establish and maintain best glide speed. Yes, recommended is 70. In this situation, he was on 68. All in all, a very good job. And if you want to get some more information about engine out, we have a nice video that Seth had created showing his own practice of engine out in an airplane with a CFI, going over some more details beyond what I just showed you right now. Let me now talk a little bit about debriefing traffic patterns. So if, again, we look at the FAA's Airplane Flying Handbook, they show a student and the instructor how to fly a traffic pattern. Personally, I like the depiction in the Cirrus POH a little better. But essentially, there are different stages that we want the student to understand and to follow in terms of speed control and the altitude. This specific scenario was flown in Archer from the POH. You're supposed to have an initial approach speed of 75 knots on the final, 66 knots above the threshold. The chart that we build here for this exercise includes these properties. We want to check with the student that the pattern was square, good wind correction, that he or she maintained good pattern altitude, start, descend, beam the numbers, 75 knots on the final, 66 knots on the threshold, 3 degrees on the final. These are, again, Archer numbers and specific for the airport used for this flight. So let's see how the student fared on those. The student is Duncan Richards, who's flying an Archer in Laconia Municipal Airport in New Hampshire, logging with the CloudAhoy app. He flew 6 traffic patterns that look totally perfect, much better than I can fly. Nice thing is that it was his first solo. Pretty amazing for a first solo. Pretty amazing for a seasoned pilot as well. To debrief those, I'm going to first declutter because we have 6 traffic patterns. Let's just select one and focus on that specific traffic pattern. To do that, I go to the declutter tool on the left and check the one pattern that I want to debrief. CloudAhoy automatically segmented the flight. It detected those 6 traffic patterns, and I select just traffic pattern number 2. The color coding here shows you in dark blue the climb from takeoff to the downwind, and then the light blue is the descent. Let's check the wind for a second. CloudAhoy shows you the wind in both barb format and numeric for every point along the flight path. In this case, it was 255 at 6 knots. Luckily, it was a pure headwind for the student. Didn't really need to do much wind correction. Let's check where he started his descent. I beamed the number is this dotted line here that I plotted. And he started his descent just a little bit after I beamed the number. So he kept his altitude and then started the descent. Still pretty good. What about the airspeeds? I'm pulling out here the graph for the descent. It was 106 knots on the downwind, 86 knots on the left base. Continuing, he is 83 knots on the final. And then over the threshold, he's 76 knots. So all in all, a little higher than what we would like, but still manageable. Because it was a little higher than needed, he actually landed pretty long. CloudAhoy also shows you other statistics about the flight when we look at the graph more closely. The maximum AGL for this specific pattern was 864 feet, a little lower than needed. The average slope was 3.2, which is about almost 3 degrees that the puppy was showing. All in all, excellent performance for a first solo, very good performance. Otherwise, the patterns were square. He maintained pattern altitude more or less, a little lower than he needed to be. He started to descend, beam the numbers, more or less 75 knots on the final. No, he was actually 83 knots. It was a bit too fast. It was 76 knots over the threshold instead of 66. So it was the whole 10 knots faster than it should have been. And the slope was good, 3.2 degrees. I'd like to take a little break from my narration and show you a video created by Seth talking about debriefing stabilized approaches. So Seth, or the video, it's yours now.
Ahoy, pilots. Seth here. One of the keys to a good landing is a stabilized approach, where a constant airspeed and descent angle are maintained throughout the descent to landing. In this video, I'll show how to use CloudAhoy to debrief your approaches and evaluate their stability. You'll see how to identify approaches in the Segments Manager and how to use segment information graphs to determine how stable an approach was. We'll look at two examples, a visual approach at the end of a traffic pattern and an instrument approach at the end of an IFR cross-country flight. Let's start by identifying approaches within a flight segment. This flight's the first solo of a student pilot in Laconia, New Hampshire. CloudAhoy has automatically segmented the flight into its various phases and displays the flight segments in a hierarchical list in the Segments Manager. It's possible, especially when debriefing traffic patterns such as these, that the approach segments may be down a level or two in the hierarchy. In order to make approaches easy to find, any hierarchy of segments that contains an approach has a black arrow to expand and collapse the hierarchy. With these segments expanded, you can see that CloudAhoy indicates segments that are part of an approach using a black and yellow segment information icon. Also notice that the segments that make up the descent to landing have been grouped together into a hierarchy, starting with the portion of the downwind where descent begins and including the base and final. Having identified the approach we'd like to debrief, we can declutter the primary view so that it only shows the pattern containing the approach. First, we want to see where the descent started. CloudAhoy uses darker blue segment colors to indicate ascent and lighter blue colors to indicate descent. So we can see that the pilot started his descent here, very close to a beam the numbers. Next, we want to check the aircraft speed and altitude during the descent. To do that, we'll open the info window for the descent to runway 26 hierarchical segment by clicking its segment info icon. Because this is a hierarchical segment, the graph also shows the segments beneath it. Clicking the segment information icon for any one of the subsegments will show a graph of just that segment. This graph shows the aircraft's altitude as a solid line and its airspeed as a dashed line. The dotted green line shows the average slope of the descent. The average slope is also shown numerically above the graph. The altitudes and airspeeds are plotted relative to the distance from the touchdown point, which is shown along the x-axis. We can see that the descent started in the downwind at about 1,400 feet MSL and at 100 knots. The student slowed down and maintained 80 knots on the base and final. On the short final, a half mile from touchdown, he began to slow and finally touched down at just under 60 knots. A glance at the graph shows that where the airspeed varied, so did the slope of the descent. Where the airspeed was constant, the descent was too. This illustrates that establishing a constant speed and then trimming the plane will result in a constant, stabilized descent. The next slide we'll look at is an instrument approach into Bedford, Massachusetts. The approach is shown in 2D with the FAA procedure overlaid in magenta in the primary view, and in 3D in the floating view. At the bottom of the screen is the segment info window for the final approach segment. Again, the hierarchy containing the approach is indicated with a black expand collapse arrow. The descent from 1,800 feet begins at the final approach fix. At 2 miles from touchdown, the airspeed stabilizes at around 95 knots. A mile from touchdown, the aircraft slows until it lands at 55 knots. Once the airspeed stabilized, the pilot maintained a consistent and stable descent slope. This can also be seen by looking in 3D. The blue flight track closely matches the published magenta glide path. The 3D cockpit view provides another way to evaluate the approach. We can use the cockpit view to see whether the approach was above, on, or below the glide slope. The VSI shows how consistent our descent was, and the airspeed tape shows variation in speed. When practicing shooting several instrument approaches, CloudAhoy automatically identifies the location and altitude of taking the mist, and you can debrief the approach leading to the mist, just like what we saw before. A stabilized approach is the key to a good landing. CloudAhoy makes it easy to identify and evaluate your approaches during debrief, allowing you to make adjustments and improvements the next time you fly. You can find additional tutorials and help topics at help.cloudahoy.com. As usual, if you have any questions or comments, please email feedback@cloudahoy.com.
Cool. So thank you, Seth, for your video. And I'm going, actually, it was a really good segue for the next segment that I prepared, which is debriefing IFR flights. So debriefing instrument approaches. For this specific segment, I also took one of the scenarios flown on the Redbird simulators. In this case, it's a relatively easy approach into Long Beach, California, ILS approach. The pilot flew it on Redbird full motion simulator. It was sent to CloudAhoy, and then the pilot went to the other tent, to the tent nearby, to debrief it. This approach is relatively simple. Not too many things to think about here. We start the approach here in the south, fly into the localizer, and end it at the runway. So let's see how the student actually fared on this specific scenario. This is the flight path. In the Redbird, you can actually start the flight anywhere in the middle of the flight. You don't have to actually take off, which is useful. And this is the evaluation chart that I created for analyzing this specific maneuver. The specific approach. We're going to judge the performance of the student based on the airspeed control, localizer intercept, glide slope intercept, and how accurate I was on the vertical and lateral. CloudAhoy segmented the flight like any other flight and color-coded the different stages. At first, the light blue is where the pilot flew level flight. The solid line, by the way, in the graph is the altitude, and the dashed is the airspeed. Next, the magenta line here describes the descent from the altitude in order to intercept the localizer. The next level flight, next summit is level flight, the light blue, starting with the localizer intercept, flying level, and then intercepting the glide slope. And then reaching the final approach fix, the pilot was following the glide path all the way down to the runway. So let's debrief it and see how well the pilot had done on this specific approach. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to rearrange the screen a little bit, overlay the instrument approach on the path, show an IFR low altitude chart on the right, and the satellite photos in the main view here. The white lines are the localizer and the glide slope. The magenta line is the published approach, published by the FAA, and then there's the flight path overlaid on it. It's actually more useful to look at it in 3D to see both the lateral and the altitude variations of the approach. We can by looking at it now and rotating it into different angles, we can see that it was a very good approach actually. So the pilot must have been an experienced IFR pilot. If we look at it from the side, the flight path pretty much coincided with the magenta, denoting the approach, the published approach by the FAA. When we look at it from the back or from the front, we see that there weren't too many variations on the lateral axis. All in all, a very good job. So what we are after now is actually to find the fine points of improvements, because we know that this pilot knows how to fly, knows how to fly an approach. Here we see, as we animate, we see the plane entering the localizer area. The pilot is now at 30 degrees intercept. You can see a magnification of the main area on the right, on the lower right. He or she are continuing the 30 degrees intercept. At this point, they have about half a scale deflection. And now, for some reason, he or she started flying at a 10 degrees intercept instead of 30 degrees intercept. So the intercept just took a little longer. I'm kind of playing it in fast speed. but eventually the localizer was intercepted, the glide slope was intercepted. We can see here the synthetic view with the approach in the sky showing the relationship of the plane to the magenta line, the glide slope. We can see that at this point during the flight, the pilot is a little bit below the glide slope. Let's look at the RPM showing here on the left. Because the pilot was under the glide slope, he added power to get back on the glide slope, and that actually did help. So he regained, he basically centered the needles again at this point. We can see that from the graph. The dotted lines in the graph are the glide slope, and he was a little bit under it, and now he's exactly on it. He's veering just a little bit, a hair to the right and the left, but he's pretty much centered on the localizer, centered on the glide slope. He's doing a pretty good job flying. Notice, however, that the airspeed started to increase at this point. Again, the dotted line is the airspeed. It was about 80, and it's now increasing to 90. My guess is that because he added power before, remember the RPM graph here, he did not pull back on the throttle, so he has more power than he needs, and as a result, the airspeed keep increasing. But all in all, he's pretty much centered on the two needles. At this point, the airspeed starts decreasing. I'm assuming he pulled back on the throttle and maybe lowered the flaps. He continues his flight, veering just slightly a hair to the right and to the left. At this point, he's at the decision altitude. He's probably the instructor removed the view limiting devices, or maybe the cloud cover that was simulated by the Redbird. And the pilot now just lands visually into the runway. All in all, a very good approach with some things to think about. If we look at our little table here, airspeed control was good. Localizer intercept was okay. He should have been a little more aggressive and maintained the 30 degrees intercept, but all in all, it was good. And the other factors, glide slope intercept and accuracy, were all very good. This is just a segment from Flight Shops. Let me lower it. Many of you have seen Flight Shops. Steve is flying in different situations, and is not ashamed to show shortcomings of some of his techniques. He's flying here with Jason Miller. They are flying in the soup. Steve cannot find the airport. And he's using CloudAhoy to show the mistakes that he had made and discuss them during that segment. Okay. I'd like one more thing before I wrap up my presentation here. Show you something that we are doing in the lab, if you like. A sneak preview of a feature that we are developing now would be out sometime in the future. We are working on improving the approach graphs. This specific flight was given to us by a gentleman who stopped by our booth in Oshkosh, 2016, flying in RV-12. You see here the approach graph with the altitude and the airspeed, just like we saw before, but the new addition here is that we add the runway, and we add more information about what happened near the runway. So we can see here the airspeed and altitude and how stabilized or not the approach was. It was pretty stabilized. As the pilot gets near the runway, we are going to show some more information. So the first thing that we show is where the runway actually began. We are here on the very short funnel, as you can see. And by the way, we show here the glass gauges overlaid on the actual video, so the glass gauges we compute. Right now, I kind of pause the video when he's over the threshold, as shown not only in the video in the 2D depiction here, but also in the black line showing the runway in the graph. And the stuff that we're going to display, in addition to the average slope that we are displaying today in Debriefs, we're going to show the touchdown distance, going to show the runway remaining. We're going to show other important things pertinent to debriefing and approach. So that's the end of my sneak preview. And I'd like to wrap this up and talk a bit about what's there for the student pilot using CloudAhoy. Well, a student pilot that uses CloudAhoy with CFI or just by himself or herself will get more out of the training flights. They can focus on a specific aspect of a flight pretty quickly by decluttering and just zooming on the specific thing that they were trying to train for or to practice. They can see whether or not the goals were met, whether if you care about your airspeed during landing, if you care about your altitude, if you care about steep turns, how well did you do, how more training do you need, and you'll get to your next flight more prepared and maybe with more questions to the CFI. The CFI is able to use CloudAhoy to highlight problems areas to students and to provide objective and quantitative analysis of the flight, including explaining things to the student that the student actually heard during the flight, but we all know that the cockpit is a lousy classroom, and many times the student didn't really internalize it during the flight, or maybe even he thought that he or she did something else than what was actually done. This is a good way for the CFI to highlight what was actually done in the flight. We firmly believe that debrief is important for almost every flight, certainly every training flight. This is our About Us page on our website where we actually list what we believe in. We believe that the debrief needs to be effective, needs to be objective, needs to be analytical. And we do believe that good debrief should be accessible to every pilot everywhere, including general aviation. Obviously, the military are spending a lot of time after each training flight and after each sortie to debrief what happened in the air. Airline pilots debrief their training. It has to be done by general aviation as well because it's so effective. It creates better pilots, safer pilots, and cuts the expenses of those pilots as they study towards the check ride. So that's pretty much my presentation, and I'd like to open it now to Q&A while showing you some miscellaneous debrief scenarios and taking your questions.
Okay, Chuck, we had a couple questions here. One that I came up with was, how do you think technology like this would bring in new students or people interested in aviation?
Okay, so I think that a lot of the students, especially the young ones, are used to use computers for viewing things and for analyzing things. They're used to using video games, for example, and train themselves in that manner. They're used to using flight simulators and train themselves. So this is really an extension, I think, for young students to see the flight the way that they would see it on a simulator at home, or the way that they use a video game. But all pilots, whether young or not, I think that they have a lot to benefit from Debrief, just because you learn so much less effectively in the cockpit, and after the flight you're tired maybe. Just take your time at home after you come back from the flight, get something to eat, and revisit your flight. There's so much more that you can learn from it by doing it that way.
Okay, one of the things I had when I operated a flight school, we'd use that social sharing. Do you want to briefly touch on that? Because I think that's really important, especially for students in the younger demographic that want to share on Facebook and things like that.
Totally. So one thing that I didn't cover is the sharing capabilities of CloudAhoy. So any flight that you had flown can be shared, and you can share the flight with just sending a link in email to the flight, and whoever clicks the link will get the same debrief that you're getting, the same paid debrief page. But you can also post it to Facebook and Twitter and just share your experience. Whenever I fly with passengers, I always share it either on Facebook or send them a link just to be able to relive the flight. I mean, they're not pilots, but they enjoy it immensely to just be able to shuttle back and forth to hit play and to see the landing yet again, to see the places that we flew over, that kind of thing. So I think that actually helps bring in more pilots to the pilot community, more student pilots, people who see this thing, debrief flights of others, and just get interested.
Yeah. Tom asked, and by the way, everyone, if you have a question for Chuck, please use the chat window in the web view. So that's the easiest way to do it, so we can keep all of the other miscellaneous chatter off. Tom asked, is there a graphical CDI display to help with initial instrument approach procedures and the accuracy of that?
Okay. Yeah. So let me just follow up on what I replied before. One thing that I did not mention, but is pretty obvious, is that a lot of CFIs use CloudAhoy for their debrief and share it with the students. So even if the student initially does not have a CloudAhoy account, they can just get the link and get full debrief of the flight. Likewise, students who use CloudAhoy, mostly younger students, share their flights or solo flights with the CFI, get some advice about the solo flight. As for your question, we don't have it yet. We don't have an HSI or a CDI as yet. We do have other aids showing you the amount of how far you were from the center line, from the localizer and the glide slope, like we saw in the ILS debrief, but not in the form of a CDI or HSI.
Okay. Herb asked, is there a list of maneuvers that you guys have that CloudAhoy can debrief? I suppose, like specifically because of your color coding system and everything where it tags it, I believe is what he's asking.
Yeah, so we don't have that list available currently on our site. We have tens of different maneuvers. I mean, anything in primary training, including dissecting the traffic pattern into segments, or steep turn. For more advanced flights, more advanced commercial maneuvers, we do things like Chandelle, for example. And we analyze other maneuvers for different other type of flights, including helicopter flights. So we would identify things like auto-rotation. For gliders, we identify things like thermaling. So depending on the type of flight, the type of aircraft that you're flying, we display different maneuvers. But we don't have a specific maneuver list that I can share with you right now.
Okay, and as a segue to that, Beth just asked, can CloudAhoy be used for commercial maneuvers?
Yes, it can. So we analyze chandelles, and we analyze different types of approaches. I think that the only commercial maneuver that we analyze spirals the only one I can think of right now that is not yet debriefed by us is lazy eights, and it would be coming in the future. So we do commercial maneuvers as well.
Okay. I have an additional question to add on here. Do you have a rating system for this, and is there like something that would keep track of sequential things, sequential lessons?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and the answer is that we don't have it now, but we are working on it. That's the most I can tell you about it. So it's definitely something in our future to be able to provide a student with kind of a virtual CFI or provide a CFI with an objective scoring system so the student can actually see the progress that they make. The CFI can help in honing on specific maneuvers that are not done as well. So expect more things to come.
Okay, so more things to come. And Tom, I think that also kind of goes into your question that you just had there. And we just had another question here. Yeah, and it was Nate just added that you can create custom segment to evaluate any maneuver that is not already built into CloudAhoy. So I suppose that's true, Chuck? Okay.
Yes, correct.
Okay. Beth said that she's taking her first commercial lesson tomorrow and will try to use CloudAhoy.
Okay.
You have any pointers for her?
I would just watch our videos. The videos are available in our homepage and also in help.cloudahoy.com. They are short videos. You'll be done watching them in 15 minutes, and I think it's just useful to know a little bit about CloudAhoy before the first time. If it's the first time ever that that person is using CloudAhoy, I would recommend reading about GPS best practices. The gist of it is that if you're using the internal GPS in your iPhone or your Android device, just make sure it has good sky visibility. Don't put it in your pocket because it will not get good reception there.
Yeah, when I used it, I always used like a dual GPS, even if I was doing it off my phone, and threw it up on the dash, and that always seemed to give pretty reliable.
Yeah, correct. That's what I'm using. Yeah, those small GPSs. If you're using FlowFlight, just log the flight with FlowFlight and import it to CloudAhoy.
Okay, wonderful. Anybody else have any questions before we close down for the day? All right. Well, Chuck, we really appreciate all of the valuable information you've given us. And again, we appreciate the discount that you've given for all of our members. Obviously, go to our member benefits section. It is listed on there. And if you have any other questions after that, you can contact Chuck through his info page, and or you can obviously contact us, NAFI at nafinet.org. And I think that's about it. So look for new things to come. Again, check the Facebook page. Check our main page for information on AirVenture. We're going to have a completely dedicated page to AirVenture with all of the stuff that's going on. So please take a look at that and enjoy the rest of this evening. Okay, thank you very much, Chuck. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Rick. Thank you very much, everybody.